Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of RPGs with Paddy. I'm Paddy. I'm sorry for the delay in getting this out to you. I was trying to read a little bit more of the expanded fiction related to this scenario in the hopes that it would help my review. It didn't, but I'll go into that more after the spoiler warning. Today we're going to be looking at the sixth and final scenario in the collection Sacraments of Evil. This scenario is called Signs Writ in Scarlet, and the players will be drawn in to investigate a series of murders in the East End of London with cryptic clues. This scenario should really be run with both experienced players and an experienced keeper. I think it has the potential to leave a sour taste in the mouths of first-time players, so I would recommend avoiding that. But anyway, let's dig into the spoilers now. If you're a player who doesn't know this scenario, you should stop watching now. But keepers who are thinking of running the scenario, or people who have already played it, let's jump in. The plot of this scenario is centered around a Hound of Tindalos, although there is a much more immediate human killer to deal with. I definitely recommend reading the original short story, The Hounds of Tindalos, before running this. It's in a number of collections, but most recently I read it in the Cthulhu Mythos Mega Pack, which has 40 modern and classic Lovecraftian tales. It's a pretty short story. There's also a dramatic reading of it on Horror Babble's YouTube channel, and that lasts about half an hour. As I mentioned in the intro, I tried reading more fiction on the Hounds of Tindalos to see if it would help with this scenario, but it really didn't. So, what happens is a crazed woman is on the loose, killing men and carving strange symbols into their corpses. The investigators have to try and find out who the killer is and why they are doing it. The killer is a woman called Joan Baildon. She was working at the Malbury Asylum for the Insane. Her boss, Dr. Vandorf, has been using the Liao drug on her to send her mind back in time through previous lives and back before human lives and non-human lives as well. When she comes back to her time, to the present time, he hypnotizes her to forget about what she's experienced, but he's doing scientific research. The most recent time, he sent her back too far, and a Hound of Tindalos captured her scent. When she came back, Dr. Vandorf hypnotizes her again, but it doesn't work. He doesn't know why she's so unhinged this time. Joan, in her insane state, has taken on the persona of her late mother, Crazy Annie, who was a mad, murderous prostitute who had been incarcerated in Malbury Asylum before. So Joan goes on the run, selling her body as a prostitute to survive, but the hounds keep coming, or the hound, I guess, keeps coming after her in her dreams. So she kills men who are looking for prostitutes, and she carves angles within circles on their corpses, I think usually on their chest. The angles attract the hound, and the circle then contains them, she hopes. So you have a variety of people looking for her in this scenario. The police are chasing a murderer in the East End. Dr. Vandorf wants to capture or kill her to avoid his experiments being made public, and he sends several orderlies to search for her. Dr. Vandorf's assistant, Dr. Blessing, is not involved in this research at all. He's looking for Joan because he's in love with her. He doesn't know from the start that she's a murderer, just that she's missing. And then there's the East End Citizens Committee, which is a group of local vigilantes who are tired of the terror in their streets, and they want to take matters into their own hands if the police can't stop it quickly. So that's the keeper's background information for this game. There are a few different ways for the investigators to involve, which I always appreciate, having that option, that variability. The East End Citizens Committee could approach them asking for help. Scotland Yard could ask them for help. Or the investigators could even just see the reports of it in the newspaper, and that's provided in the scenario as well. And then when they see that, maybe they decide to investigate the matter themselves. The strange and occultish carvings in the chests of dead people should be, hopefully, enough to pique their interest. So now that the investigators are involved, where can they get started? This scenario really presents the main source of information as the coroner's inquests. These are public statements, public reports that determine the identity of the victim and the cause of death and describe the death. Of course, certain details will be redacted if it's sensitive to the case. But I don't think anything's held back here. If the investigators attend them, they will get the details very quickly, second only to the police. So this is where the newspapers get their information as well. If you're working at the request of Scotland Yard, if they were the ones who brought you into this case, you might even get an early look at some of the stuff, but really the scenario wants you to be present at least most, or at least some, of the inquests. Just before we go into all of the details of the inquests, I want to introduce the NPCs. One of the big strengths of this scenario is the wide array of NPCs who really have a lot of conflicting goals. It leaves open a lot of interesting role-playing for the GM and for the players. We have 3 core police detectives, some of whom your characters may have met before in previous scenarios. We have Inspector Cleveland, who is generally irritable and uncooperative. Craig, who often wears a disguise trying to blend in with the locals in the East End. And Spalding, who is the local East End inspector. Then we also have a vigilante group, the East End Citizens Committee. So they are going about, and they're headed by a man named Hackett, who is kind of a real rabble-rouser, looking to turn the vigilante group to serve his own political ambitions against the upper classes. He's kind of tired of the poor people, or the people in the East End, getting the short stick, and he wants to, take control of this region. We also have the coroners. There's 2 of them. Most of the information in the inquests will be given by the very nervous Partington White. And then there's also a very suspicious coroner surgeon called Dr. Raffin. And he has a morbid obsession with the gruesome murders, and he's kind of suspiciously out on the streets of the East End at night. Then there are the orderlies from the asylum. So we have Rutherford, who is a thug, Niavicki, who is a sadistic and illiterate drunk, and then the hulking, I think they have him as almost 7 feet tall, but he's actually very kind-hearted and good, is Manch. Then, of course, there are the 2 doctors from the asylum. There's the mad scientist running all the experiments, Dr. Vandorf. And then there's a younger assistant, Dr. Blessing, who, as I mentioned before, is in love with the murderously insane Joan Baildon, who is killing everyone while trying to escape the Hound of Tindalos. So in contrast to the previous scenario, the Scuttling, these characters are all quite well developed and presented in this scenario. However, how the investigators get from A to B is a little less obvious. This is going to leave quite a lot of work for the Keeper to lead the investigators where they need to go. I will go through the schedule very soon, because it's all the information is laid out very clearly. A lot of kind of set dates for events to happen. But just before we do that, I think it's helpful for you to know about the end game first. So when you're listening to the schedule, you can start thinking of ways how you might be able to lead your investigators to that place. So for this scenario, to solve it really, either you need to go to Mulberry Asylum and investigate around enough to find Dr. Vandorf's journal, which explains what's going on. Or the investigators could find and catch Joan Baildon, and then maybe gain her trust enough that she confides in them what has happened. And now this is going to be limited because she isn't in the right mind. She thinks she's her own deceased mother. She thinks she's alive. If it turns out that the investigators are completely lost, Dr. Blessing can find the journal in the asylum, and he can come to the investigators if he knows that they're involved in the case, which he probably will at some point run into them. I'd say that this last one is kind of a weak solution, so try to avoid it unless absolutely necessary, because it's taking the solving the mystery out of the investigators' hands. So here's a breakdown of the timeline. Days are broken into morning, afternoon, and night. I would say feel free to move the events around to suit when your investigators are present, particularly the big clues in the coroner's reports. The core dates are from October 24th to November 3rd and a little bit November 4th. Prior to these dates, there are already 3 victims. Andrew Clark, a sailor, his body was found on October 20th. Paulo Rodriguez, a Portuguese fruit seller, his body was found on October 22nd. And Tom Vernon, murdered on the 23rd. So I won't go into all of the details for every day, but just what seems important and relevant. I've color-coded the tokens to help you keep track of who's who and who's where in each case. I've got blue for the police, white for the coroner doctors, red for the evil Dr. Vandorf, his 2 evil orderlies, and also his 1 kind-hearted orderly, because they kind of work together. And then I've got green for Dr. Blessing, who's trying to save Joan, and purple for Joan herself. October 24th, morning. Basic details about Andrew Clark's murder in a meeting hall in Whitechapel. Maybe there's a connection to a prostitute. Parrington White is the presiding coroner, and Spalding, Cleveland, and Craig give evidence. In the afternoon, the inquest into Paulo Rodriguez is held in a small music hall in Stepney. His throat was cut. At night, nothing of note. October 25th. In the morning, continuing the Clark inquest, Dr. Raffin talks about the victim's throat being slit, probably with a straight razor, and the special carvings in his chest. It's an X inside a circle. His money and belongings were missing. In the afternoon, similar to the morning, Dr. Raffin testifies about the Rodriguez case, talking about more lacerations, probably with a straight razor, and the strange carving, a rectangle within a box. His wallet was missing. At night, Rutherford and Niewicki, Dr. Raffin, and the disguised Sergeant Craig can all be found in the East End. October 26th. In the morning here is split in two different locations. The Clark inquest wraps up. There's no real outcome, just saying it was murder by person or persons unknown. The Rodriguez inquest continues. There's key information here that several strands of brown hair, 17 inches long, were in his hand. In the afternoon, they start the inquest into Tom Vernon in a school in Whitechapel. At night, Hackett and his goons are roaming the street and pubs in groups. Rutherford and Niewicki and separately Dr. Blessing are looking for Joan. Dr. Raffin is also here. October 27th. In the morning, the Rodriguez inquest continues. In the afternoon, the Vernon inquest continues, and there's key information that his trousers were found around his ankles, suggesting that a prostitute was present. His throat has been slashed and stabbed multiple times. A V in a circle is carved into his chest. His money was gone. At night, Dr. Blessing and Hackett and his goons are out on the street. Joan kills her 4th victim, another sailor, Charles Petit. Investigators could find the body. October 28th. In the morning, if they're working with the police, they may be asked to check out Petit's body and the carving. Otherwise, it will be revealed to them in 2 days at the inquest. Also in the morning, the Rodriguez inquest ends. Hackett's men make a scene about the police's inability to solve the case. In the afternoon, the Vernon inquest continues, and there's key information. A spool of thread was found near Vernon's body. At night, disguised Craig, Hackett and his goons in gangs, Rutherford, Niewicki and Mancha, Dr. Raffin and Dr. Blessing are all roaming the streets of the West End. October 29th. In the morning, the papers read Jill the Ripper, reasoning that the hair and the thread points to a woman, and 2 victims were last seen with or searching for prostitutes. The Vernon inquest ends with nothing of note. In the afternoon, nothing. At night, Rutherford, Niewicki, Mancha, Blessing and Craig, in disguise, are in the East End. But the main thing is Hackett and his goons are mad and become a lynch mob after reading the Jill the Ripper headline. They find 2 women covered in blood fighting in the street. Being a lynch mob, they assume the worst and subdue the women, preparing to hang them. It turns out they're actually just midwives fighting over the share of pay. but the mob isn't going to listen to them. They're going to hang them. The investigators may be able to disperse the crowd in any number of ways, using a police whistle, fast talk, persuade roll, shooting into the air, etc. Fumbled rolls, however, can lead to the hangings continuing and the investigators getting beaten up badly. Probably Hackett will be smart enough not to be directly involved in what happens here. October 30th. In the morning, the Vernon inquest continues, with Craig and Spaulding present. In the afternoon, the inquest for Petit begins. If the investigators haven't already seen the body 2 days earlier, they find that his throat had been cut cleanly, apparently with a straight razor, and he had a symbol carved into his chest, 2 triangles within a circle. Rumours in the crowd and later in the newspapers say Petit was leaving a pub, the Blind Horse, with a young woman. Just be careful with the description of the throat cutting here. The previous ones had been described as rough throat cuts, and this one is described as clean. You can use that if you want to throw suspicion on the creepy Dr. Raffin, who's always hanging around late at night, but it could complicate things for your investigators if they think that there are 2 murderers or something. Equally, this carving could possibly be seen to be inconsistent with the others, as it's a little bit more advanced, but as you'll find out soon enough, possibly the next day if they're working with the police, it's just Joan trying to make more complex symbols to try and keep the hound at bay. At night, disguised Craig, Spaulding, Rutherford, Nievicki, Mancha, Dr. Blessing, Dr. Raffin, and Hackett and his goons are all around the East End. Joan manages somehow to evade all of them and kills a young guy, David Cook, with a much more intricate carving in his chest. This can be found, the investigators can stumble upon it, and with a Cthulhu Mythos roll, it can be discovered that it is a mark of Tyndalon, which links to the Hounds of Tyndalos. She killed him with a Marlin's bike, which can later be found that it was Petit's, her previous victim's Marlin's bike. But that's not super important, it just links all the murders. October 31st. In the morning, again, if the investigators are working with Scotland Yard and they haven't already found the body, they'll get advanced look at Cook's body. Otherwise, they will have to wait. The Vernon inquest ends, and Hackett calls for the resignation of Spaulding, Cleveland, and the Met Commissioner, Sir Edward Bradford. Hackett and his goons are thrown out. In the afternoon, the Petit inquest continues. It is confirmed that Petit was last seen with a woman leaving the Blind Horse pub. She's described as between 20 and 25, attractive, short, and with long brown hair. The newspapers report that Cook's father is offering a £500 reward to solve the case. At night, there are several extra constables out in the East End, as well as many gangs working for Hackett, all searching for a woman, but that's about it. Rutherford, Nievicki, and Mancha, and separately Dr. Blessing, are looking for Joan specifically. November 1st. In the morning, more newspaper articles asking for help solving the murders. In the afternoon, the Petit inquiry continues, nothing really of note. At night, Craig, Dr. Blessing, and Hackett and his gangs are on the street. Joan takes her final victim, Giovanni Bacala, and the same carving is in his chest as the previous victim, Cook. So if there's several chances to see this same carving. Which I'll put up on screen once it's revealed on November 3rd. November 2nd, in the morning, again, if the investigators are working for or with the police, they will get to see the body in advance of Giovanni in advance. And again, with the Cthulhu Mythos roll, they can identify that it's a mark of Tyndalon. In the afternoon, the Petit case continues, but nothing important. And at night, everyone is out in the East End and everyone has a short temper, spoiling for a fight. On November 3rd, in the morning, the inquest into David Cook begins. In the afternoon, the Petit inquiry ends. And at night, Cleveland and Spaulding launch a massive manhunt on the streets of the East End. And just before dawn, the Hound of Tyndalos arrives in London. But of course, that will be discussed a little bit later. Now, you might be thinking, how are my investigators supposed to find Joan? Or how are they supposed to get to the asylum from that information? Well, as if you're asking that question, I'm in total agreement with you. There's not much there in the scenario as written. You really have to add in extra hints about what's going on. There are several shady characters involved, but the ones that stick out at the inquest are the orderlies from the asylum. Everyone else kind of has a reasonable reason for being there. But the orderlies, why are they there? Why are they at most of the inquests? If you question them, they won't tell you who they are, but you can see them getting into an asylum carriage. So you could follow them as well. If you get to the asylum, you'll probably be turned away. Certainly at this early stage, there's no real reason for you to break in and try and find out any extra information. But you will keep seeing these orderlies around the East End, even prowling the streets at night. So you should probably, or your investigators should probably loop back to the asylum at some point. And it's kind of up to the keeper, to hint at that subtly enough that it doesn't look like you're telling them, hey, you have to go to the asylum, but also not so vaguely that they kind of skip out on it completely, because given the time frame of this investigation, it could really ruin it if they don't get to the asylum and if they don't get there quickly enough. Anyway, the idea suggested in the scenario is that the best way to get in and to find out the information is by breaking in at night. But really, the investigators don't have anything to go on apart from the fact that the orderlies are there. So you kind of have to witness them doing a few shady things to get an idea, and then maybe breaking in. As mentioned before, Dr. Blessing can act as a bit deus ex machina later on if the players are still struggling. So he finds out what Dr. Van Dorf has been up to, and he can ask the investigators for help. On the other hand, as well, if Dr. Van Dorf finds that you're suspecting the asylum, or you're asking too many questions, prying into the asylum's business, maybe researching it too much, he will have you committed in secret. So this will be either if a small group of you come to the asylum and interview him, he might drug you and put you in the asylum, or he might just have some of the orderlies kidnap some of your investigators and bring them to the asylum, and then he controls everything there. He can move you around, and no one's going to listen to the inmates of the asylum. In the asylum, which is described quite well here, but I'll just give you the important parts. If you break in, you can find a lot of occult tomes, and even a Cthulhu Mythos tome as well, von Prin's Mysteries of the Worm, and it's in English. Reading the handout for this book, for Mysteries of the Worm, is kind of an essential hint towards the Hounds of Tindalos and the Liao Drug. Without this, only a Cthulhu Mythos roll on the final two, which are identical carvings, link it to the Hound, link all of these murders to the Hounds. So without that, they won't know until there are mysterious sightings of the Hound at the very end of the scenario. The attic in the asylum contains two things of interest. First is bundled papers for both Joan Baildon and Billy Ashworth, and these are patient records. So Billy Ashworth was Van Dorf's subject of the Liao Drug before Joan. And the second thing of note in the attic is Billy himself. So he went too far back in time and became a subject of Ubo Sathla. He is becoming a kind of a mindless spawn, and his muscles are slowly detaching from his bones. He can't talk. He's relatively harmless as he is. He doesn't want to cause any problems, but he's locked up in a cell in the attic regardless. He might break out later, or you could free him, but this is a clue of what's going on and what's getting Joan in trouble. So the other way to try to solve this mystery is through the clues left behind, mainly the hair and the spool of thread. So the hair indicates that it's probably a woman, and the spool of thread can be linked back to a haberdashery. Unfortunately, the haberdasherer who's named on the spool of thread. He sells so many spools, he can't remember who bought what. But he directs them, probably it's one of the sweatshops down in Wentworth Street or Osborne Place. Once you go there, nothing much can be learned here, except that the worker is also probably staying at a doss house, which are very, very cheap lodgings with kind of like communal beds, or communal bedrooms, kind of bunk beds. Extremely cheap, no frills at all. And that it's probably in Thrall or Flower and Dean Street. If you go there, again, the scenario itself says this is probably pretty much a dead end. So, like, you're following all these kind of half clues, and it's all just dead ends. But if you get to one of the DOS houses and you succeed on a halved luck roll while asking about a woman in bloody clothes, a midwife, or a woman who's always in new clothes because there's blood on hers. If you do all of that, then one of the older women at the DOS house will vaguely recall something about, a woman who kind of matches that description. But a younger girl kind of contradicts her, saying that it's crazy. That's crazy Annie. Now, just that information could be enough if the investigators research it. Crazy Annie might link them back to the asylum, which might then lead them back to Crazy Annie's daughter. Kind of. It's very, very tentative connection there. But if you make another halved luck roll, then while this conversation between the older and the younger woman in the DOS house is going on, then Annie, or Joan, I should call her, she comes back at that point, and either of the two women can point her out. So in that case, Joan, who considers herself to be Annie, will be tense, but she will respond to some questions, but she'll absolutely deny that she has anything to do with the murders. If the investigators kind of push too hard or become aggressive, she will try her best to escape and will call out that this is a police raid on prostitutes there, which will cause a panic and a kind of a stampede among all the clientele. So there's no mechanics written down, but it just says she'll probably escape, and it's very unlikely that you would find her in the same way again by looking in the DOS houses. On the other hand, if you can convince her that she needs your help and that maybe you believe her, then she can confide in you about her treatment and the dog thing, the hound. She can explain how she hopes to keep the hound at bay with her carvings into the corpses. If she's turned over to the police, or if the police find her, she will be found by the hound and killed on November 4th. If she is returned to the asylum, either to Dr. Vandorf or to Dr. Blessing, the hound will find her and kill her on November 3rd, so just a little bit earlier. If the players try to shelter her, the hound will find and kill her on November 4th. So it really seems like she's going to die anyway, and once the hound has killed her, its job is done and it will be gone back in time. So, if you haven't read The Hounds of Tindalos yet, it's a little bit confusing and kind of like not so fully explained, which is good. But basically, they can travel through angles and not through curves. And there was something that happened like back at the very beginning of creation that kind of separated us out into two realities. So we have kind of like the angled reality, which is where the hounds live in. And then we have the curved reality, and humans are made of curves, I think is what it was. So anyway, the only way to avoid Joan being killed is to have her in a place with no angles. And the scenario is pretty strict about this as well. It says there should be no pages and no angles on any clothes that you're wearing, and nothing. So she should be within a circle that has no angles inside it, or a sphere. Although, it's almost impossible to get a sphere at this stage. But either of those solutions will keep a hound at bay. It does say if there's a circle, anything above or below that, including the ceiling and the floorboards, if there's any angles there, the hound will get in. There are two other slightly suggested ways that you could combat the hound. And these use two new spells found in the Von Prynne book. One of which takes a long time, well, potentially a long time, depending on the intelligence of the investigator, to create an artifact. And the other one is creating a dust that is particularly harmful and will help you defeating the hound. And another solution is potentially using the call or summon Hound of Tindalos spell to lure it into a trap, which you have to kind of create. So anyway, all of the events that have happened so far, or that I've mentioned just before, will happen. But then November 3rd will come, whether the investigators are ready or not. At 9 p.m., the hound arrives in Dr. Van Dorf's lab, killing anyone present. If Joan is there, the hound will kill her, and that will be that. It won't attack any of the patients in the asylum, but it will mess with the locks, and a lot of the patients will be set free. And God, what's his name? The guy up in the attic, Billy will be set free, and that will cause some havoc and loss of sanity to people around and stuff like that. If Joan is not there, not in Dr. Van Dorf's lab or not at the asylum, the hound will go out and wander the streets kind of into the night and mostly into the day of November 4th. It will kind of go through the East End, Hackney, Stepney, Whitechapel, all the scenes of the previous murders, kind of following Joan's scent. There'll be many, many reportings of a horribly mutilated dog in all of these places. And at 5 p.m., it will find Joan and kill her, unless the investigators can stop it. It's a little bit unclear in the scenario, and I guess you could leave it up to the situation and the keeper. But once thwarted, so if you have like a perfect sphere or a perfect circle, will the hound then just give up? Or will it just come back the next day? Is this going to be a daily ritual? Or do you have to wait until the magical artifacts, the Crux and Sata from Prynne's book, is complete, which banishes the hound? Alternatively, you could say that once thwarted like this, it never returns, which might be a little bit anticlimactic, but, judge based on how the game is going for your players. So that's the scenario. There's a whole bunch of results that really depend on how your investigators handle the situation. They will gain or lose sanity and credit rating based on things like saving Joan or losing her, solving the mystery, shutting down Van Dorf's experiments, killing some of the orderlies. Only the tall and kind-hearted and innocent Manche is innocent and good, so killing him is bad. Killing the other ones is good. Is killing good. And there's many, many other factors where you can gain or lose sanity and credit rating. I won't go into all of them here. But this is very good because the actions of the investigators really have a big impact on their lives and their careers going forward. You have likely made some powerful allies and or enemies. So, for example, if you worked well with Scotland Yard, they'll be very grateful. On the other hand, if you maybe were working for the East End Citizens Committee, they might be very powerful people to have in the lower stratus of society there. So that might be really helpful for going forward. On the other hand, If you've made enemies of them, then going into the East End might be very dangerous for your investigators in the future. There's also a final section here that says that the investigators' crimes should be punished, leading to things like credit rating losses or even imprisonment. This could be a very interesting dynamic. I guess that there's also the possibility of the investigators being sent to Malbray Asylum under the care of Dr. Vandorf if the investigators are not careful. So if the investigators come to Scotland Yard and they say crazy things about taking drugs and dogs appearing through angles and being protected by circles, if they haven't found any incriminating evidence against Dr. Vandorf, they could definitely be in for it next. So, as I said, that's the scenario. It has a lot of points that I like, but it really needs a very experienced keeper and pretty experienced players too. The wide cast of pretty well developed NPCs is very welcome. The good section detailing the East End, which I didn't really talk about, but there's a good section kind of breaking down the East End there. That's very good. And then the realism of the public coroner's inquest, that's all great. Really like that. But the way that the information is doled out means that there's not much for the investigators to do at certain points. All of the things that they might think to do, especially early on, will kind of lead to dead ends. Even those early carvings, they try and research them. They do occult rolls, mythos rolls. They try to find out any meaning, any secret language. All fails because that's all wrong. There's nothing really you can learn at the library. You try to go to the asylum, you get turned away. You have no real reason to be looking there anyway, so what are you going to do? The scenario also specifically says that Joan avoids getting caught on nights when she's out killing people, despite the fact that there's loads of people looking for her. And it's a relatively wide area, and there's lots of side streets and stuff like that, similar to Jack the Ripper. But yeah, it's just a little bit, there's no chance that anyone finds her in the act. There isn't really a strong connection to the Hounds of Tindalos. There's no reason for the investigators to think Hounds of Tindalos until you get into the asylum and read the information there. And that's fine, that's where you have to go. But what's leading you to the asylum? It has to be the presence of the orderlies at the inquests and around East End. But this poses a couple of problems. First, it can seem really heavy-handed at first. Which kind of draws... You have this wide cast of interesting and suspicious characters. But when you've got these, asylum orderlies sticking out like a big sore thumb, being present where they shouldn't be present, really, it kind of draws all of the suspicion away from the other suspicious characters. And when you lock onto them, that's the right solution. There's not really much reason to start suspecting other people as well. But even if you do go to the asylum, you'll likely get turned away. And again, you really have no idea what you're looking for. So there's just a lot of waiting for the next day and nothing really you can do in between. And then Dr. Blessing giving you the information later on is a bit of a cop-out, because it takes away the agency of the players to solve the mystery. So the players are kind of left with very minimal breadcrumbs to follow up on. So that's why it's essential that you have experienced players that won't feel totally lost with nothing solid to grasp. There is a heavy emphasis on the coroner's inquests. Like, that's probably at least half of the scenario written wise is the coroner's inquest, but there's really not so much important information in them. So the players are waiting for the next day to get more information, but they don't really get much when that comes. Things that, you can research this, but they're all dead ends pretty much, apart from a few key items. Having a time limit on the scenario is fine, but it can be extremely frustrating for players because they're unaware of it. And being unaware of the time limit is fine. But the problem is, the Hound could come and kill Joan and disappear forever without any solution being found by the investigators. Now, you could work this into a really interesting extra scenario where the players have this thirst, this need to find out what happened. So then they have to travel back through time with the Liao drug to figure out what happened. But that's a totally different time traveling scenario, and that's always messy to do. Finally, the suggested solution is to create a circle or a sphere with absolutely no curves in it. That's only very vaguely hinted at in the scenario through the symbols. To give the players a chance to come up with the solution, especially if they've never read the Hounds of Tindalow's short story, then I would recommend having a little bit more clues about Joan and her fear of angles. Maybe she has been tearing off the corners of her clothes. Everything's kind of like smooth and curved. And maybe she's been doing that in the sweatshops or something. Maybe her bed in the DOS house is arranged in a certain way, trying to avoid angles. Maybe you find some traces of plaster at the scenes of the crime, or maybe she has plaster on her hands or something like that. A plaster is used in the short story. Not the protagonist, but the victim of the Hounds of Tindalos in the short story is trying to plaster up his room so that there's no corners in his room anymore. Now, you can still have some mistakes when it comes to making the circle. You can still have some mistakes by the player. For example, they forget one thing, and this can lead to a really tense situation right before the Hound arrives. So you can have Joan feeling that, the Hound is going to appear imminently, and then suddenly someone realizes that they've got something in the circle which is which has a curve, an angle in it. But yeah, that could be something interesting to throw in. But without that hint, if the players don't know the Hounds of Tindalow's story quite well, I think it's exceedingly unlikely that the players will come up with the solution themselves. Now, when I'm playing, I don't need the investigators to survive at all. But if you're not careful, they will die without understanding why or how. Now, not understanding everything is certainly a big part of cosmic horror. And I think the Hounds of Tindalos is actually a great example of this. We don't know how or why. We don't really understand. All we know is that at some point in the past, like, the hounds and human and mankind kind of diverged into angles and spheres, and that doesn't make sense to us as well. We know that the hounds travel through angles. They can appear through time, through angles. And that's enough. We don't understand all of what's going on. But in this scenario, if there's a lot of pitfalls where your investigators could die without having even an understanding of what just happened. And I feel that could really fall flat among your players if you're not careful with it. Overall, it's a good, okay scenario. I think in the hands of a very experienced keeper and some experienced players, it could be a good to great scenario. But other than that, it's probably not worth your time playing, in my opinion. Well, that's going to do it for today. If you liked the video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. I'm still a little bit torn about the next video that I'm going to make for next week. Whether I want to focus on the solo adventure Alone Against the Static, or move on to the next collection of Gaslight scenarios in the Dark Designs collection. Should I say that? I'll say it. One of the scenarios in the next collection also features a Hound of Tindalos. Very interesting. If you have a preference for which I do first, Alone Against the Static, or move on to Dark Designs and Eyes for the Blind, let me know in the comments. You know, I'm flexible. But that is everything. So take it easy, everyone, and I will see you next time. Bye.